the CIA was in effect acting as America's hidden Ministry of Culture.
While this document shows the CIA was working on the use of LSD and other drugs for unconventional warfare, evidence supports that the battlefield would include whoever opposed their racist pro-war agenda.
Flying in arms to our allies, flying back out with the heroin. The first target being U.S. GIs during the Vietnam War, the second target being the United States itself.
Infiltration of cocaine into the Black Panther Party, its leadership, Huey P Newton being the main target.
The head of the DEA at the time, Robert Bonner, said that a ton of pure cocaine worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been smuggled into the United States. He blamed the CIA.
And we know the FBI had a 300-page file on Lennon. Much of it remains classified for national security reasons. The doorman at the Dakota that night was Jose Perdomo, a veteran of the CIA's botched Bay of Pigs invasion, a professional hitman.
I cannot think of a case in which I have had someone inject himself with a large amount of heroin and then proceed to kill himself. It just doesn't make sense.
We're speaking with Brother Tupac Shakur, who was the national chairman of the New African Panthers.
The Code of Thug Life is a revolutionary document. He began to broker the peace between these gangs.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redman. You can hear this show here at porkinspolicyreview.com. If you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can, of course, find me on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM, Podbean, a whole mess of podcatchers. There are always new podcatchers that are picking up the stream. You can follow directly, of course, through the RSS feed on my website. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to, if that is your particular mode of listening. And of course, if you want to support the work that I do, then you can always go to patreon.com/Pierce Redman. You can become a subscriber for as little as $1 a month. Of course, that single solitary dollar not only helps me out tremendously, but it also gives you, the listener, access to the exclusive bonus podcast. So I think it's well worth the full single dollar for that. And you can also send a donation on PayPal as well. Certainly people like to do that, and I don't plug the PayPal as much, but you can find the PayPal button on the left-hand side of my website. Well, we are joined once again by John Potash. He is an author and filmmaker. John was on the show, this was, I don't know, maybe like a year or longer ago, to discuss his excellent book, The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, U.S. Intelligence's Murderous Targeting of Tupac, MLK, Malcolm, Panthers, Hendrix, Marley rappers, and linked ethnic leftists. A very popular episode indeed, and John has joined us once again to discuss partly his book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and other leftists, but also the release of the film version of Drugs as Weapons Against Us. So I'm very excited to have John Potash on the show with us. John, how are you? It's been a little while.
Good, Pierce. Thanks for having me on again.
Absolutely. Well, I guess, why don't we just sort of dive right in? I think back when we did the Tupac show, I think we probably mentioned Drugs as Weapons Against Us, but give the listeners just a quick summary of what the book is and perhaps, what the movie is and how they differ.
Sure. So, well, the book is it's some 430 pages, maybe over 1,000 endnotes documenting all the sources for the material, and it's got a lot more pictures and documents because my publisher's a bigger publisher who can get a lot more in there in one book. But the movie is basically the sources saying a lot of what I said they said. Might even have a few more twists on certain aspects of the book. But the book, of course, is a lot more detailed, a lot more comprehensive, because movies, a 2-hour movie is about a 60-page script. That's that when you read 60 pages, it turns into a 2-hour movie. So, the 430 pages versus 60 pages is going to be a lot different. But the movie has some of the CIA whistleblowers, FBI whistleblowers, DEA agent whistleblowers saying what I said. They said I have John Lennon talking about some of the incidents, Kurt Cobain talking about his life, Tupac in there briefly on his life, and some of the SDS activists, leaders of the Students for Democratic Society in the 60s, some of the Black Panthers talking about what was going on and the targeting of them with drugs. And occupiers talking, for the Occupy Wall Street movement, talking about the film MK Occupy, because it's part of the film MK Occupy, which I used. So there's a whole lot in there. The sources directly saying, what I show in, and some of the print sources, the government documents, all shown in this film.
Absolutely, and the film is fantastic. It's tons of sources that you cite in there. It's one of those things. It strikes me whenever you talk about like the use of drugs by governments, intelligence agencies, the sort of overall story of the drug trafficking and the involvement of governments, is that there are, as you point out in your film and in the book, there are lots of, fairly mainstream to absolutely mainstream articles and books talking about this. It's not really, like a secret. It's not something that, that these governments can really deny. Specifically, too, some of these government programs like MK Ultra, but also just the broad, use of drugs against people. It's not something that people can try to deny it all they want, but as you point out, there are lots of mainstream references to all of this.
Yeah, the interesting thing about it is, like, ABC covered MK Ultra and covered, the Senate Church Committee, saying there's over 16,000 pages on MK Ultra. When researchers end up finding 30,000, but either way, so some of the mainstream media talks about it, either in a documentary or Washington Post saying, CIA infiltrate 17 groups and found, distributing LSD into those groups. And yet they never talk about it again. That's the interesting thing. They deny their own reporting at that time. So there's a time when they're more open about it, and then they basically hide that they ever talked about it after that. That's the way it sometimes works.
Yeah, it was funny. You included a clip from I think it was a Frontline documentary back in the late 80s with Judy Woodruff, who you can see every night by tuning in to PBS for the NewsHour. It's just funny to see Judy Woodruff talking about the CIA trafficking and cocaine and guns with the Contras and
trafficking heroin at that time from Vietnam to the United States. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, I doubt, not to like knock Judy Woodruff in particular, but I doubt she's going to be talking about that on the NewsHour nowadays, especially PBS, like all of these news outlets, have become so sanitized, and PBS is really just like the NewsHour is like one long commercial for like B&E, the shipping company, and like Lockheed Martin. But again, it is fascinating the way that so many of these media personalities and outlets do report on this, and then, like you say, they just sort of like pretend like it never happened, deny that they ever did, that they ever covered this. Well, let's dive a little bit into some of the larger ideas that you present in Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And I guess to kind of preface this with, it seems like at the moment, John, we live in a society that has become, fairly liberal. If maybe that's not the best word, towards drug use. We've certainly seen like the proliferation of cannabis companies and, all of these pushes to legalize cannabis throughout the United States. Certainly like another kind of weird explosion of the praising of like psychedelic drugs like DMT and things like that. You can see that endlessly in the alternative media, and even, like Joe Rogan, who sort of straddles both lines, constantly praising it. And I think that your book is really sort of like a warning against a lot of this stuff, and warning that I don't think that I don't know. Maybe I'll let you kind of answer this. If you're it's not like an anti-drug book. You're not saying to people don't use drugs. Maybe you are. Maybe you are. I'll let you kind of
Sure.
fill that in. But it did kind of. When I watched the film, I really was like, "Ooh, shit! Like maybe this isn't, such a great idea." And maybe, this sort of like, I don't know. It seems very like en vogue at the moment to be like pro-drug, for lack of a better phrase.
Sure.
And I don't know. I just kind of throw that to you, John. I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I don't even talk about legalization or, illegal or legal. It isn't even, something I deal with in my book or my movie too much, except for the fact that I think they use weed to criminalize tons of young people, and I think that's terrible. And so I do mention the idea that, yes, we should stop, we should decriminalize marijuana. Though, on the other hand, I think that people are thinking that marijuana is healthy for everything, and that's ridiculous. Sure, some medical marijuana can be good for some things, and that's fine with me. But too many, people are starting to smoke weed. I counsel people for, addictions and other mental health issues. And I'm seeing too many young teens getting into regular, weed smoking and really ruining their grades and really hurting their futures. And that's a serious problem there too. So, I'm fine with adults smoking weed recreationally, though they really have to watch, what's in it, what's laced with. And so if it's legal, and they want to smoke recreationally, that's fine. If they're smoking daily, they got to watch that. That could be really hurting their lives, and how it may be making them lazier or a little stupider and all that. And, that's an issue. But that's when it comes to, full-fledged cannabis dependence. That's a problem, obviously, because dependence means, it's causing problems in their life. That's part of the definition. And yet they keep using it anyway. Just like alcohol is legal, but people, can develop problems with alcohol. So I'm fine looking at it as a medical issue and not a legal issue. Now, I don't even care about the legalization or illegal, or still being illegal, all the other drugs. I just care about the way U.S. intelligence uses it to hurt us, to divert the anti-war movement. They used it to divert the civil rights movement and to hurt the minds of the best, activists in the anti-war and civil rights movement. And that's what MKUltra was about. The CIA's Project MKUltra was started in 1953, and it was the culmination of a number of other projects, such as like Artichoke and Bluebird. And so they tested about 36 different drugs on thousands of soldiers. And so they knew by the end of the 50s, they tested on the soldiers, and then they tested on what the U.S. Senate Church Committee report said were people involuntarily dosed and involuntarily took these drugs because they were put in their drinks or things like that at all social levels. And so they tested them on all kinds of unwitting subjects. And then they came across the fact that, they were using these drugs, and particularly LSD, but many other drugs, to manipulate people and to make people think they were acting in ways that they believed to be their own, but were really, on behalf of what the oligarchs' agenda were, which was a incredibly racist and, pro-war agenda. And so that's what the oligarchs used propaganda for, but that's what they were also using drugs to help affect. And some of their own reports also said they felt like it could basically divert these activists and hurt them from staying involved in activism. And as William S. Burroughs said, he thinks that these psychedelics make people less competent, and that's shown in a number of ways. And a load of big LSD promoters of the 60s who were activists ended up agreeing that that they think that the CIA distributed it en masse to their groups and other groups of anti-war activists and civil rights activists to basically hurt them and diffuse and hurt their movement. And so now they particularly used musicians because they know musicians capture the hearts and minds of young people who tend to be activists. And so I show the evidence that they manipulated some of our favorite musicians like the ones on the cover, Kurt Cobain, John Lennon, Jimi Hendrix, and Tupac Shakur, as well as Janis Joplin and the Rolling Stones, to try to start using drugs. But then when a lot of these musicians started sobering up and getting more into their activism, they were neutralized in different ways. The four main ones I talk about were murdered. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones was also murdered. Janis Joplin, her sister believes, got what they call a hot shot, an overly pure dose of heroin when she was trying to kick heroin at the time. And so the evidence I show in the book and film is that under MKUltra, Project MKUltra in 1965, for example, the deputy director of MKUltra, Robert Loshbrook, brings over thousands of hits of LSD, loads of agents, tons of money, and directs these agents to put the LSD in as many musicians' hands as possible. And this comes from A.E. Hotchner, who was a longtime editor of Ernest Hemingway. And he wrote the book Blown Away, where he says this, and he quotes the agents that were distributing it to the musicians. And so this is part of the way it worked, because that was the same year that John Lennon and George Harrison were dosed. George Harrison's dentist put in John Lennon and George Harrison's coffee at a little dinner they were having with him. And 2 years later, Mick Jagger gets his first hit of acid from an undercover FBI agent who was also working for MI5, which was British FBI, a guy named Dave Schneiderman. And this came out in the Daily Mail newspaper within the last 5 or 10 years. And so this is just some of the ways it works.
Yeah, and the startling kind of frequency with which this happens, and again too, this is a lot of these musicians openly talked about this. I think John Lennon, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney all were like, yeah, we did not want to do this. This was completely, they spiked our coffee or drinks and stuff like that. And I think even Paul McCartney talked about like the peer pressure to do acid, was so intense that's why he did it.
Right. Yeah. And they surround them with agents, and they own most of the media. So they have so much, propaganda, pushing these drugs, believe it or not. And then when they, outlawed LSD, and then they pushed it as a, anti-establishment drug. And they owned the small, supposedly grassroots newspapers like the Oracle, which was supposed to be like a version of the Village Voice over in San Francisco. But these small newspapers that looked like they were from, grassroots phenomenons that were anti-establishment, when really they were pushing psychedelics like crazy. And the people that started these, newspapers had ties to U.S. intelligence. And so when they were called AstroTurf kinds of media, or fake grassroots. It's known in public relations as fake grassroots. They call it AstroTurf campaigns.
Yeah, and you also have like figures. You mentioned him in the film, Owsley Stanley, who's also known as like Bear Stanley of Grateful Dead fame. He was one of the sound engineers for the Grateful Dead. And I full disclosure, I'm sort of like a former Deadhead. I was like really into them. But it's funny, like you think of them as like this ultimate like, counterculture group but they're like so kind of bizarrely right wing and kind of conservative.
Yes.
Kind of hyper capitalistic. And then you get people like, Owsley Stanley deeply connected with them. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about him.
Yeah. So, Hank Harrison, I interviewed Hank Harrison for about an hour or two, and Hank Harrison was the original manager of the Grateful Dead when they were called the Warlocks. And then he when he stopped being their manager, he lived with Phil Lesh of the Grateful Dead up until about 71 or 72. They had started in about 65 or so. So Augustus Owsley Stanley III, his full name was, came from a Kentucky blue blood family with fathers and grandfathers who were senators and governors of Kentucky. And so he's in the military for a short bit, then he comes out and he's over in San Francisco, and he's producing tons of LSD and tons of speed, of amphetamines and other drugs. And so here he is fighting for the management pretty much of the Grateful Dead. So Harrison said he was really a big fan of Saul Alinsky and he was very left wing, while Owsley was very right wing. And so they were kind of fighting for, management and influence over the Grateful Dead, and Owsley won out. And so Owsley, was pushing for a very non-activist agenda of the Grateful Dead, and a good friend of Owsley's was a guy they called Sasha Shulgin, Alexander Sasha Shulgin. Now, Alexander Sasha Shulgin was a regular chemist for one of the top chemical companies that was, I think it was DuPont, that was making chemicals for MKUltra. And they were making ecstasy, they were making STP, they were making these super psychedelics. And he was constantly with the Grateful Dead also. They said they were constantly, it was like a joke about there's Sasha and the Bear hanging out on the side of the stage at all the time with the Grateful Dead. So I argue that a lot of those drugs were tested on, the crowd that followed the Dead, but they originally was started with the acid test. And so Ken Kesey was a student at Stanford, and to make some extra money, he went through the MKUltra experiments, 1962 or 3 or so. And those experiments were funded by a CIA front group called the Human Ecology Fund. And the Human Ecology Fund got loads of money from the CIA without these, a lot of these people knowing it, who were getting the money from the Human Ecology Fund. It was 44 different colleges, about 40 or 50 hospitals, another 40 or 50 prisons were all getting tons of money to do experiment with psychedelics. When poor students would accept about $150 per experiment, $150 by today's money, I say. But people at hospitals were getting experimental in prisons, as I said. And so Kesey was one of them. And I show the evidence that he was manipulated to then work for the hospital, given the keys to the supply of LSD. So he stole tons of the LSD, and they knew he was stealing it, obviously. Had parties, LSD parties at his home in the Stanford area. Then these merry pranksters, who were mostly in the military, influenced him to take a psychedelic bus across the country, and happens to go through all these southern states where the civil rights movement's huge at that time, around 64 or so. And he promotes LSD to all these activists in the South who were, working for civil rights work and stuff. Then he takes it to Harlem and drives through Harlem right after the riots there, the race rebellions there. And then they come back and they start these acid tests. And these acid tests get bigger and bigger. The Grateful Dead is playing for them regularly. And they have vats. First they have tubs, big bowls, and then it turns into huger parties where they have vats of punch that's all spiked with LSD. And some people knew the LSD was in there, and some people didn't, and were just drinking something to cool off after dancing the Grateful Dead and getting dosed involuntarily. And those got bigger and bigger, and turns into the Trips Festival, and then turns into the Human Beings, which were the Trips Festivals were said to be about 10,000 people there, and the Human Beings were like tens of thousands of people. And then they turned into even bigger fest. But Kesey actually wanted to stop the acid test after about the second or third acid test. But a number of these people that had just come out of the military were all surrounding Kesey and pushed it to keep going. And the people that were attending those acid tests were top MKUltra scientists, according to legal depositions of the top MKUltra psychologists. It's a CIA MKUltra psychologist named John Gittinger, said in a legal deposition that him and 2 other CIA scientists were at the Trips Festival and at several of the first acid tests. And then they also were joined by 2 other members of MKUltra there. And so, it just shows that this was all MKUltra work. And they did the same thing on the East Coast with Timothy Leary, who admitted that from 1963 onwards, he knew he was working for the CIA. And he was pushing psychedelics and LSD all over the country.
Yeah, and you also point out, because again, I mean, and I think a lot of people are now aware that Leary was just such a fraud, but you also point out that when he fled from Algeria back to the U.S. and he became an FBI informant, I mean, it's just a total absolute fraud. From the get-go. But I guess, but it's funny. Even some of those things came out a while ago, but it's taken so many years until now where it's sort of widely accepted. John, let's get into some of the more radical leftists and people that were specifically targeted. First with the LSD movement. I mean, you talk about SDS, also the Black Panthers. And just talk a little bit about that, because like with SDS, it seems unfortunately fairly successful in what they were able to do. They were able to sort of derail the movement and push many of the top-ranking leaders of the SDS to kind of just become, for lack of a better, just burnouts. Not very intelligent, not really offering much. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, Leary's mantra, which was heavily covered by the media and really, by television stations. And I have him saying on a television program, turn on, tune in, drop out. That was repeated over and over again. And he would say that, you young people that are, pretending to be activists, you have menopausal minds, and you should be searching for spiritual freedom and religious freedom, which is what he called, using LSD was religious, a religious search, and you shouldn't be getting involved in politics. I'm sorry about my fax machine going off.
Oh, that's all right.
So that's what he was pushing, and a lot of people were accepting that, and he was trying to influence loads of people to drop out of the movement in SDS. And so he set up shop. A group called the Mellon Hitchcock family were was one of the wealthiest families in the world. They owned Mellon Bank. They owned Gulf Oil. They had members of their family were in top U.S. intelligence positions. And so William Mellon Hitchcock gave Leary for $400 or so his huge mansion and 3,000-acre estate an hour north of New York City to just hold tons of psychedelic parties and LSD parties up there. And Peggy Mellon Hitchcock put tons of her money in to have LSD headquarters all over the country and even down in Mexico. And so they were pushing psychedelics everywhere. And so they lured tons of activists, but, including SDS activists and civil rights activists. SDS was big in civil rights, but also big in the anti-war movement, up to this mansion, and had loads of MK Ultra scientists just hanging out at this mansion and testing all different kinds of psychedelics there. Besides just getting people to trip on LSD, they were getting them to use STP, a super psychedelic, and BZ and all that. And so by the time of 1968, you had Columbia SDS, who led building takeovers at Columbia University for the first major building takeovers against the Vietnam War. And that launched loads of building takeovers at colleges all over the country to protest the war by taking over buildings across campuses. And so Mark Rudd and the Students for Democratic Society at Columbia became very influential. But they also had declared that they were anti-LSD, saying it's anti-revolutionary. And so finally, a year later, in 1969, some FBI undercover infiltrators inside the Yippies, which was Abby Hoffman's group, held a party and influenced SDS to come to this party. They dosed the punch. Or my understanding is actually they visited an SDS party and dosed the punch with tons of acid. And they got the leaders of SDS tripping at that time and got them to believe that, well, maybe LSD is not that bad after all. And so it got them to say, to stop their anti-LSD beliefs. But after that, Mark Rudd started acting extremely irrationally and doing bizarre things. They also got, this head of the Students for Democratic Society, Bernie Dorn, tripping. And she lauded the Manson family after their, the murders, and they were bragging about not having read a book in a year, and so they were doing all kinds of very bizarre things. They were actually tying up teachers in high schools and saying they were liberating the kids in the high schools. So they were really turning off a lot of people with these antics when they were on acid. Now then, they became a lot of these leaders formed the Weathermen, which is also known as the Weather Underground, for feminist reasons. But the Weathermen proceeded to follow along with some other activists who had started bombing military-related institutions in the United States, like Dow Chemical or the courthouses that were, making horrible decisions against the Black Panthers. They were doing anti-racism work, and so in those bombings, the Weathermen carried out at least 24 bombings themselves, according to their own published book about it. But activists all over the country were leading these bombings, and so I showed the evidence that they actually did sober up more and tried to work in a different way, because they were doing a ton of other kinds of anti-war organizing, and very good organizing, but the acid messed their heads up a little bit. They broke up. The SDS broke up in '69, and then the Weathermen started to sober up a bit and did do some good work. But they were influenced to spring Leary out of jail, and then Leary thinking that he was part of the movement, and really he just betrayed them and ratted on them and gave up a number of Weather Underground leaders in New York for the FBI to capture. So Leary then takes about 20,000 hits of LSD over to Algeria, where Eldridge Cleaver is staying with his wife, Kathleen Cleaver, and formed a Black Panther in exile group over there. And so here's Leary with tens of thousands of hits of LSD. And when Eldridge Cleaver first accepted them in solidarity with SDS and the Weathermen. But then when he found he had all this LSD on him, he said he put him under house arrest and said he's trying to just push LSD on us now, and we think he's blown his mind on LSD, and so he made a pronouncement about that. And meanwhile, he was very worried about getting kicked out of Algeria if he had any drugs, in his ex compound there. So it was very. He was in a tough position, but Leary was definitely working to push acid on the Panthers also. But meanwhile, infiltrators and undercover infiltrators had gotten into different chapters all over the country with the Black Panthers and pushed drugs on them. They pushed cocaine on Huey Newton and influenced him to develop a bit of a problem for a while. An undercover infiltrator got into Afeni Shakur's life when she was one-time Harlem Black Panther leader, and she developed a cocaine problem for a number of years, and that's how they really undermined a number of Black Panther leaders too.
Yeah, I mean it's quite insidious, and it really just seems again it's just either make them kind of go crazy. Put them in a compromising position. So, that's like, with the Black Panthers and stuff. I mean, if you've got tons of coke in your house, you can get arrested. They can go to jail forever. It seems, it's very textbook. But it's scary too. The levels to which they were willing to kind of go to kind of push all this. There's a great section where you're talking specifically about the Black Panthers. You interview a number of former Black Panther, there's clips from interviews with a number of former Black Panthers, where they expressly talk about that the goal was to destroy Huey P Newton and to make him into a fool, and just to make him become more erratic. And again too, if you're cocaine is such a powerful drug too. Just the amount that it inflates your own ego, but also makes you hyper paranoid. You can just see how that could destroy any kind of revolutionary movement. And also too, let the listeners know too, John. The Black Panthers were super anti-drug, but they were opposed to drug use. They didn't want it. I think they rightfully understood, the amount of drugs being pushed into the Black community in general. Be it heroin in the 50s and then, cocaine later in the 70s and 80s. But, just to talk a little bit about that, the Panthers' opposition to drugs.
So, the Panthers I talked to said of course they were anti-drug. They knew what it was, how it was being pumped into their community, especially from the Vietnam area that was called the Golden Triangle for poppy fields. As I said earlier, the CIA was shipping heroin from Vietnam, and really all the evidence points to that they were targeting into the black communities to really disrupt the black communities. So that's one of the reasons the Black Panthers were so anti-drugs, and they knew that how this could work, how it could undermine their activism and be used against them in all kinds of ways, to arrest them, to addict them, and so that was huge. But they also had undercover agents even use drugs to turn Fred Hampton unconscious. And so when they were going to raid his home, and so undercover agent slips in his drink, he's unconscious when the FBI, basically the police, Chicago police, shoot thousands of bullets into his home. And then when they find him unconscious in his bed, they shoot him, and kill him in his bed and drag him out of his bed to make it look like he wasn't in his bed. But all the evidence is there. And this wasn't even a shootout. There was the other head of the Southern Illinois Black Panther Party, I think his name is David Clark, was also shown to be asleep when they were shooting at him, and only fired one shot straight up in the air because he was guarding the door at that time and was asleep. But his gun, involuntarily went off. But so it's just incredible how they use that against the Panthers. So. And that just continues, though, to today. And so I also show how, they got John Lennon eventually, using heroin. Jimi Hendrix only tried a number of harder drugs a few times, but by the time he was, about a year or two before his death, he had actually been sobering up, according to his fiancée, Monica Danneman. And after Martin Luther King was assassinated, he became much more radical, and he started saying in interviews, "You got to support your Black Panthers. You got to get the Black Panthers to change things." And he was dedicated his last album to the Black Panthers, and he was getting involved in all kinds of activist work. And he tried to do anti-war benefits, but his manager had admitted that he formerly worked for MI6, which is British CIA. But all the evidence showed they still worked undercover for MI6. And so he was trying to sabotage Jimmy by putting super amount of LSD in his drink before a benefit show. And, Jimmy had already gotten away from LSD by the time, and it hurt his guitar playing in a big way. And he had to, end benefits early. And within 48 hours of Jimi Hendrix's death, he had fired Mike Jeffrey, his manager, and during that 48 hours, he was killed. He died, of course. And Mike Jeffrey admitted to two people that he had Hendrix killed. When Jeffries was drunk, he admitted he had Hendrix killed. He pretended it was for different other reasons. But who can get have someone killed within 48 hours unless you're connected to British or U.S. intelligence?
No, the theme too of sobriety is so interesting amongst a lot of the musical figures, and also too, activists as well. When John Lennon gets sober, he's of course murdered by Mark David Chapman. You point out the fact that Kurt Cobain was not using heroin, up until this bizarre suicide. And I say suicide in air quotes. The same with Jimi Hendrix had stopped taking LSD after Martin Luther King's assassination, and he was still smoking weed and stuff like that, but not nearly he wasn't using drugs to nearly the extent that he was, a few years ago. They definitely seem to dislike sobriety, and I want to even say too that some of the Black Panther leaders, when they started to sort of stray away from drugs, that's when a lot of them were set up for bogus, shootings and gun charges and, a whole series of, if they couldn't get them with drugs, they would get them legally.
Right.
And I want to say that I think you mentioned that in the Tupac book, some of the, big Panther leaders out in Los Angeles that, when they became sober or, strayed away from cocaine, that's when, all sorts of, bizarre, shootings, attempted murders on cops and stuff like that. That's when the legal problems come
But
in.
I didn't have any LA Panthers using any drugs. It was really just I just talked more about Huey Newton and Afeni Shakur. But when Huey Newton did sober up, he was set up for murder, or assassination. And Afeni Shakur, after she sobered up, and I don't have this. This was more recently. Her death was somewhat mysterious, and it was actually really mysterious because of the fact that they actually gave her body over to her estranged husband. And so it's totally bizarre. But and they both were, doing activist work after they sobered up. So, I still, the thing about John Lennon, though, I just want to point out, though, is that, Mark David Chapman was involved in his murder, but there is evidence also that his doorman, Jose Sanjanas Perdomo, was actually helped out in that assassination. And he was a CIA hitman. He had been involved in the Bay of Pigs and invasion, and so it was very
of all the doormen in the world,
right? He gets a job, a month before John Lennon's murder, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I mean that's probably, we could do a whole podcast just on Lennon's assassination. But there's all sorts of things with this Cuban doorman and. Letting people in and out of the Dakota and, in the immediate aftermath after Chapman shoots and stuff. I mean, there's a whole, he's worth looking into. If for nothing else, I mean, even if you don't want to accept that there might have been more to it, I mean, it is just like, of all the people in the world that's a doorman at the Dakota, it's this guy. John, just I wanted to also, moving on a little bit, because, a lot of this is, this is, because this is the old adage that gets used time and time again when you talk about this. It's like, you bring up like Iran-Contra, which is sort of re-entered the public consciousness with Elliot Abrams becoming the envoy to Venezuela. And it's this sort of, they did that back in the 80s, but that was really just Reagan, and Ollie North, and they don't really do that anymore, even though, as you document in the film, many of the reasons, of getting involved in Afghanistan after 9/11 seem almost entirely to control the poppy crops in Afghanistan, which now produce, the world supply of opium, basically. But let's talk a little bit about, the continuation of some of these programs, because undoubtedly they're not going to go away. I think that there is a belief, with with something like MK Ultra, you can go into this direction of like, it's all about mind control and Manchurian candidates. And while I do accept that was one of the major, that was one of their goals, or they certainly wanted to experiment with that, it seems more and more, that, a bigger goal, and one that was successful, is like this, is just pushing any and all drugs on people, and just sort of, either dumbing down the population or, breaking up any kind of movement. I mean, that seems to be a much more successful result of MK Ultra, and it's kind of easy too. I mean, it's not like, with the acid, with cocaine, especially now, you have to wonder with the amount that they're pushing cannabis. Especially like you mentioned, as like a cure-all for like every single ailment in the world.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about the how this kind of transition. You touch on this towards the end of the documentary, like with like the the kind of like house music, rave movement, and ecstasy. I mean, how does that fit into this?
Well, ecstasy was originally an MK Ultra tested drug. Its precursor MDA was tested during the MK Ultra years, and then MDMA was derived out of MDA, and so they knew what these drugs could do to people. And MDMA, in international studies, loads of international studies, it's just found to hurt people's memory. And they knew that. They've tested, as I said, they tested these 3 dozen different drugs on thousands of soldiers and other people over a decade or more. And to know what it does to people, what it does to their minds and everything else. And so I show on film, of course, the head of chemical warfare for South Africa, who during the apartheid era, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had his assistants say that this guy, Wouter Basson, had directed him to manufacture a ton of ecstasy. And then Wouter Basson was caught dealing it in black neighborhoods during apartheid. And so he says on film in the British documentary that he was working with Porton Down, which is the British chemical warfare, center, and Fort Detrick, which is the American chemical warfare center, which is in Maryland, not far from me, in Frederick, Maryland. And so those were the places where they were developing chemical warfare, and he was dealing with them, and he was a major ecstasy trafficker. And so was he just trying to make those, people in the black communities during the apartheid era feel good? And was he just trying to make money? No, he was trying to damage them. He was trying to damage their minds. And they knew what this was doing. They knew it was damaging people's minds. And now it's so popular as ecstasy or Molly, they call it these days. And they know what it's doing to young people's minds. They know it's hurting young people's minds. And today we have MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, along with the Heffter Institute. And I show all the links of them to the Human Ecology Fund I talked earlier about in our interview. That were CIA. Human Ecology Fund was shown to be a CIA front company. Anthropology Today showed all the evidence. Yes, it was a CIA front company. So that's known. And so today, with all the links that Heffter and MAPS have to the Human Ecology Fund, it's pretty clear cut. And they're doing the same things. They have unlimited amounts of money. They're holding tests with psychedelics to promote psychedelics all over the world. They're holding these experiments all over the world. They're getting the media, which I show in my film and book, are overlaps. Basically, 6 multinational corporations own 95% of our information we get. Which is most of the media, and I show how that all works. And they share boards of directors with these media companies, and by corporate law, you're not supposed to do anything that hurts the profits of the corporation. So when defense contractors and oil companies and pharmaceuticals, are shared in the boards of directors, you got to follow their line. And so, of course, they're pro-CIA projects that are against the anti-war movement and have to be against civil rights work and anti-racism. They're very racist, of course, and so. MAPS is is promoting ecstasy like crazy, is promoting LSD like crazy, and they're getting these colleges to follow through with these experiments by giving them tons of money. And I know how this works, personally. And so this, they get tons of money. They're not, turning away the grants, and even the NIH's. And then, National Institute of Mental Health are pushing for, okay, well, let's try to use these psychedelic mushrooms and other psychedelics on, people for depression. It's the new antidepressant.
PTSD.
Yeah, and they're saying let's use ecstasy for PTSD. Now, there's all kinds of non-drug ways to treat PTSD. There's EMDR, which is an acronym for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and there's another technique that are very non-invasive and don't have any side effects that are incredibly effective. And so for them just to push these psychedelics and ecstasy for PTSD is absurd.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the PTSD, I mean, I don't understand how that works, especially when you think that, a lot of people suffering from PTSD, be it from, serving in endless wars in the Middle East and South Asia, or, just from sexual violence or what have you, some traumatic event. I mean, a lot of people tend to abuse drugs like alcohol, painkillers and stuff. So it just seems like, it's not like just prescribing some other drug. It's not actually solving the problem. It's sort of like putting a Band-Aid on it. If you have PTSD and you drink heavily, yes, you might feel better, quote unquote, for a short amount of time, or you forget what's happening. But I don't really quite understand how taking Molly, if because you were I don't know, butchering people in Iraq, how that's actually going to make you feel better or actually solve the problem, more importantly. You know, I mean, and again, too, it's not a surprise that in America that's, you know, just take a pill, you know, rather than, I don't know, talk it out or, you know, I mean, there's so many forms of non-invasive therapy, as you point out.
Yeah, so the Heffter Institute, you know, is funded by one of the Rockefellers. The MAPS has huge funding from billionaires and has
the Pentagon too, right?
Yeah, well, it's got all kinds of connections to the Pentagon, to former members of the Human Ecology Fund and the LSD trafficking, of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. So I just show that in the book and the film, all those different connections. So they're just trying to push us on us really to hurt our young people's minds and best organizing and best activism and you know, divert them from good work at stopping the oligarchy from rolling over us and having perpetual war, which they do, but also murdering, you know, young black males and, you know, blacks in general, shooting them in the back for no reason, which is going on today.
Yeah, no, I mean, both the MAPS and the Heffter Institute are two groups that I was sort of unaware of, and you know, deserve more scrutiny. I'm glad you brought both of them up, John. And just very quickly, you know, if people in connection with that, they can look up another character that you reference and talk about, William Picard, who's sort of like a modern day Owsley Stanley, or the next incarnation of him, was producing insane amounts of LSD in these like underground bunkers. You know, and he seems
silos.
Yeah, and he seemed to be like friends with everybody at MAPS and Heffter, who, of course, you know, all these like, you know, Harvard scientists and whatnot that didn't go to jail, even though they were taking Picard's acid. Very quickly, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention it again, bringing this all the way to, you know, to kind of current times. You also talk about you know, how drugs were used against the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I bring that up again because, you know, when that happened, you know, and I can attest to this to an extent. At the very beginning, you know, like I went to Zuccotti Park with friends just to see what it was about. And at the very beginning, there was this moment of like, oh, wow, maybe something is going to happen here. And then, of course, it sort of devolved and you got a lot, you know, everyone starts kind of the infighting and whatnot. But, you know, the introduction of drugs, specifically in Minnesota, is really interesting. And I think it, you know, whether that was the single factor that brought down Occupy, I don't know if I totally, I think there were a variety of things.
There were a variety of things, sure.
You do see that, like, that movement is gone. Nobody really talks about that, you know, I mean, which is, and I think that as a movement was really, it was so broad in a good way, you know, that this really is like, you know, all of the issues that we're suffering are essentially because, you know, this 1% elite population controls everything and basically mooches off of all of us. So just talk a little bit about the, you know, what was going on, say, in Minnesota in particular.
Yeah, so in my book, I talk about, you know, a number of ways that the Occupy movement was targeted. But yeah, in my film, I happen to highlight the filmmakers who made a film called MK Occupy, and obviously with a nod to MK Ultra. And what they did is they had a number of police officers around Minnesota offering drugs and basically bribing people of the Occupy movement that were sitting in this one area of Minneapolis, and getting them to use, you know, smoke incredibly strong weed, but also smoke spice and K2, the supposedly synthetic weed, which is really all kinds of different chemicals. It's not synthetic weed and can cause people problems. And to try all different other kinds of drugs, saying that they'll pay them if they'll give them money to buy all different kinds of drugs, but also trying to get them to bribe them to inform on the Occupy movement. And when they got them using all these different kinds of drugs, they hurt their minds. And so I just show how that same program that these officers were doing with this, that this filmmaker caught them doing, and interviewed all these people that were pulled out of the Occupy movement to do this. it was found that this was a national program. It was, happening all over the country. And so my guess is usually when people are caught at things, it's not the only time or place that they're doing it. They've done it many other times, and they were probably doing it many other places, meaning all over the country, using it against the Occupy movement. So it's just one other, tactic or strategy used against the Occupy movement. But I argue that was a major one. And people in the Occupy movement in other parts of the country actually just thanked me for what they did, because they said they were set up with drugs and then arrested, and their lives were messed up, by police planning drugs or getting them on drug charges and hurting their best activism when they were doing really great organizing with the Occupy movement before that.
Yeah, and right, it should come as no surprise that they would do this, and and there's all there's other examples of this within the past couple of decade or so, where people get caught with drugs or I think like there are people like like Barrett Brown, who it seems like his while he was using drugs, while he was doing all this incredible work exposing, government secrets and whatnot, I mean, it seems like the FBI and others, exacerbated his drug use, or they used his drug use against him. That was their in. It didn't really matter if he wasn't really hurting anyone or doing anything, wrong. But, and again, they'll exploit your drug use against you, which is, I think, also just like a cautionary tale. If you're going to be an activist, unfortunately, you kind of have to keep your nose clean.
Sure.
Because they'll use anything against you.
Yeah, for people that don't understand, you had mentioned Cobain before. For Kurt Cobain's case, I of course show that the head of the former president of the American Academy of Forensic Science, saying that I show him in the film saying that he believes Kurt Cobain was murdered and it was made to look like a suicide, and he based that on all the evidence, of course. And so Cobain's case was he was very into left-wing activism. I show that a little bit more in the book than I do the film. But he, his blood test a month before he died showed that he had no illicit substances in his system whatsoever, except for Courtney Love's Rohypnol or roofies. But best evidence was that he was murdered, and it was covered up by the authorities. And of course, Courtney Love, all the evidence shows that she aided in that murder of him.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, I mean, that's like another one too, where there is this like plethora of information, much in the same way, like it's really not a conspiracy theory to talk about like the FBI targeting both Tupac and Biggie, and without getting sidetracked, people can listen to our previous episode. I mean, the Biggie one is like there is almost no doubt about that whatsoever.
Yeah.
But John, just kind of wrapping things up, is there anything specifically you want to impart with the listeners? Anything that related to what we're talking about that you're seeing happening that you want to maybe warn people against? And also, I mean, if we can end on a positive note, that's always great. I mean, I do think that there is a resurgence of activism happening right now. And while it may not be quite, as forceful as you or I might like it, I think it's going in a good direction. So anything you want to leave the listeners with, and also, where can they go to see the film? I know it's been at a variety of film festivals. Tell us any, dates, anything you want to plug.
Yeah. So, the film is available to rent or purchase. Go to drugsasweapons.com and you can find all the places you can rent and or buy the film, but you can rent it in places like Vudu, Vimeo, iTunes, Microsoft Xbox, YouTube Rent, Google Play, those kind of places. You can buy it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Best Buy, Target, Walmart, etc. And you can buy it directly from me at that website. But it has won a number of awards at about 13 different film festivals. And so people have liked it. I'm happy about that. So I just, for activists, I just think Black Lives Matter activists and and other, some people are still involved in the Occupy movement doing good stuff, but a lot of people are into the Antifa movement and, which anti-fascist movement and all, and they're doing good work. I just hope, I think they and a lot of the people, some of the people on the cover are still alive and still trying to do good work. And I think they are, and they've resisted, some of the attacks and targeting of U.S. intelligence. And I hope that we all can just, really think independently, and some activists have done, to realize that you just can't believe the propaganda that's pushing these drugs on us so hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I would certainly echo that. I think we need to be a little bit more, not fearful, but I think we need to be more aware of what's happening and how drugs have, from, as you point out in the film and in the book, going all the way back, to the 1800s and with the British opium trade, have continually been used against us. So just to keep that in mind. John Potash, thank you so much for joining us. I highly recommend your book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, as well as the FBI War on Tupac Shakur. And I highly recommend Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the film. Definitely go out and rent a copy, or buy the film as well. So John, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on again, Pierce.
I tried to forget all the pain, insane in the game. I tried to forget, trying to make $1 bill out of some change. But I'm right up here, the ghetto streets, everywhere is the same. I tried to forget all the ghetto BGs, trying to make them a name. I tried to forget.
Raised in the ghetto off meager means, fight to survive, head packed full of dreams. Ambition was a mission, which way to move. I'm tired of hearing my mama sobbing, crying the blues. Went to school on high waters, across the